Rose's hands were steady as she adjusted the collar of her black uniform in the staff mirror. They had to be steady. 3 years of waitressing had taught her that much. But her breath caught as she tilted her face toward the dim light, examining the work she'd done that morning. The dark brown skin of her cheekbone bore a blooming purple shadow that hadn't been there when she'd closed her shift last night. She had spent nearly an hour layering concealer in her cramped bathroom, building coverage in thin coats the way the YouTube tutorial had taught her, praying the bistro's amber lighting would do the rest of the work. It was 5:45 on a Wednesday morning, and Marchand's Bistro was preparing for the breakfast service that drew the city's elite. The upscale establishment with its brass fixtures and white linen tablecloths was far nicer than anywhere Rose had worked before. She had been fortunate to land this position 8 months ago, fortunate that the general manager had focused on her professional demeanor and her ability to read a room rather than dwelling on her lack of fine dining experience. She needed this job desperately. The pay was double what she'd made at the diner, and the tips from the wealthy patrons could sometimes triple her base earnings. With rent due in 5 days and her escape funds still painfully short of what she'd need for a security deposit, Rose could not afford any mistakes, any reasons for management to question whether she belonged in Marchand's refined atmosphere. Which was why she had spent 45 minutes perfecting her makeup. Which was why she wore long sleeves despite the early summer heat. Which was why she kept her smile warm and her movements precise, giving no one any reason to look at her too closely, to ask questions she could not answer. Before we dive deeper into this story, take a moment to hit that like button if you love suspenseful, emotional stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next thrilling chapter. We also want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Whether it's your city, your country, or even just your favorite spot to watch these stories, we love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's get back to the story and see just how far courage can take someone when danger is closing in. The brass bell chimed softly as the front door opened, and Rose glanced up from arranging cream pitchers on the service station. Her pulse quickened slightly, the way it always did when he arrived. Carlo Gambino. He came in every morning at precisely 5:50, ordered a double espresso with a glass of sparkling water, and occupied the corner booth by the window for exactly 30 minutes while he reviewed documents on his tablet. He always left a $100 bill for an $18 breakfast, and he never engaged in small talk beyond a courteous good morning. Rose knew who he was. Everyone who worked at Marchand's knew who Carlo Gambino was. The general manager had made it crystal clear during Rose's first week that Mr. Gambino was to receive flawless service, that his preferences were to be memorized and executed without deviation, and that his privacy was to be protected absolutely. The manager had explained in hushed tones, a very influential man with very significant business interests throughout the downtown corridor. What the manager had not said, but what everyone understood, was that Carlo Gambino's business interests included enterprises that were never mentioned in polite company. That the impeccably dressed man in the custom-tailored suits was rumored to control half the commercial real estate in the financial district. That city officials sought his approval. That competitors who challenged him had a tendency to relocate their operations to other cities very abruptly. Rose had been intimidated by him initially, but 8 months of serving him his morning espresso had taught her that he was unfailingly courteous, that he never raised his voice, and that his dark eyes, though penetrating, held a certain quiet respect when he thanked her for her service. She had begun to look forward to his brief morning greeting, to the way his generous tips helped her inch closer to the freedom she'd been saving for. Today, Carlo Gambino entered wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit that probably cost more than Rose earned in 6 months. His dark hair was precisely styled, his beard neatly trimmed, his presence commanding in a way that made other patrons instinctively lower their voices. Two men in dark suits followed him inside, taking positions near the entrance and the side exit. His security detail, Rose had learned. They arrived every morning, never ordered anything, and monitored the room with the focused vigilance of people trained to identify threats before they materialized. "Good morning, Miss Barkley," Carlo said as he approached the hostess station, his voice a low baritone with the faintest trace of an accent that made her last name sound more elegant than it had ever been. "Good morning, Mr. Gambino," Rose replied, reaching for a menu though she knew he never looked at it. "Your usual table is ready." He nodded, reaching into his jacket to retrieve his wallet, a gesture Rose recognized meant he would be leaving his customary tip with her before he even sat down. She led him to the corner booth, acutely aware of his presence behind her, of the way other diners tracked his movement across the room. "I'll have your espresso out in just a moment," Rose said, placing the menu on the table though they both knew it was merely protocol. "Thank you, Miss Barkley. No rush." Rose turned toward the kitchen, focusing on maintaining her professional composure, on not letting her anxiety show. She was aware of him settling into the booth, of the way his gaze followed her movements the way it always did, observant but never invasive. She concentrated on the familiar ritual of preparing his espresso exactly as he preferred it, pulled for precisely 23 seconds, served at 160 degrees, accompanied by sparkling water with a single lemon wedge. She returned to his table, setting the small porcelain cup and water glass on the white linen tablecloth with practiced precision.
"Here you are, sir."
"Perfect temperature, just as you like it." Carlo picked up the espresso cup, but instead of dismissing her with his usual nod of thanks, he remained focused on her face. Rose felt her heartbeat accelerate. He never lingered over the morning exchange. He always acknowledged her service and immediately turned his attention to his tablet. "What was different today?" "Miss Barkley," he said quietly, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "That bruise on your cheek, it was not there yesterday." Rose's blood turned to ice. Her hand moved instinctively toward her face, toward the place where she had so carefully applied layer after layer of concealer that morning. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Gambino."
"I'm not."
"And those marks on your wrist," he continued, his voice still quiet, but with an edge of something hard beneath the politeness. "Also new. You're left-handed, so you favor that hand when serving. The sleeve shifted when you set down my water glass. Fingerprint-shaped bruises, I believe. 4 of them." Rose's throat constricted. She glanced toward the kitchen, calculating whether she could excuse herself, claimed she needed to check on another table. But Carlo's gaze held her in place, and she found she could not look away from those dark eyes that saw far too much. "I'm fine," she managed to say, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "Really, it's nothing. I'm clumsy sometimes. Bruise easily." "You were clumsy yesterday as well?" Carlo asked, his tone devoid of judgment but weighted with implication. "Because yesterday morning when you served my espresso, there was a fading mark on your left forearm. Older, yellowing, but still visible to someone who was paying attention." He had been paying attention. The realization sent a confusing cascade of emotions through Rose. Fear that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. A dangerous flicker of relief that someone had noticed. Panic about what would happen if she admitted the truth. "Mr. Gambino, I appreciate your concern, but I really am fine," Rose said, trying to inject firmness into her voice. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other tables to attend to." "Who did this to you?" The question was soft, almost gentle, but there was something in Carlo's tone that made Rose's skin prickle with awareness. Something dark and dangerous that suggested the man sitting before her in the expensive 3-piece suit was capable of violence that would make her situation at home seem mild by comparison. "No one," Rose whispered. Please, I need this job. I can't. Please don't make this a situation. I'm fine. Everything is fine. Carlo was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that felt like it stripped away every defense she'd built. Then he nodded slowly and lifted his espresso cup to his lips. Of course, Miss Barkley. Forgive me for overstepping. He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. I notice things. And I notice when someone is in danger. Rose's alarm pierced the darkness at 4:30 a.m., the same as it did every morning. She silenced it quickly, her hand shooting out from under the thin comforter before the sound could wake him. Marcus lay beside her, his breathing deep and steady, one arm flung across her side of the bed in a possessive sprawl even in sleep. She slipped out carefully, her movements practiced and silent, years of this dance teaching her exactly which floorboards creaked and which could bear her weight without protest. The bathroom mirror revealed the damage in unforgiving fluorescent light. The bruise on her cheekbone had deepened overnight, a purple-black shadow against her dark brown skin that makeup alone wouldn't hide. Rose opened the cabinet slowly, extracting her arsenal, color-correcting primer in peach tones to neutralize the purple, full-coverage concealer 2 shades lighter than her natural complexion, setting powder to lock everything in place. She worked in layers, each application deliberate, waiting between coats for the products to set. 40 minutes. That's what it took to erase the evidence, to reconstruct the face of a woman whose biggest concern was whether the espresso machine needed descaling. She pulled on her black uniform, long sleeves despite the summer heat building outside, and secured her natural curls into a low ponytail. Simple. Professional. Unremarkable. The woman in the mirror looked tired but whole, and that would have to be enough. The morning shift at Marchand's began at 5:30, which meant Rose arrived at 5:15 to prep the service station and review the reservation list. She moved through the empty bistro in the pre-dawn darkness, the familiar routine soothing in its predictability. Silver polished to gleaming. Cream pitchers filled and chilled. Fresh flowers arranged in cut crystal vases. By the time the first patrons arrived, Rose had transformed the space into the picture of effortless elegance that wealthy people paid premium prices to experience. Mr. Caldwell came in at 6 sharp, ordered his egg white omelet and black coffee, left 15% exactly. Mrs. Chin arrived at 6:30 with her assistant, discussed commercial real estate acquisitions over poached salmon, left $22 on an $80 bill. Rose smiled warmly at each of them, anticipated their needs before they voiced them, made herself essential in that invisible way good service required. She kept a running tally in her head, $18 from the Caldwell table, $22 from Mrs. Chen, $35 from the investment bankers who ordered the tasting menu, $75 before 7 a.m. If the morning continued at this pace, she might clear $200 by the end of her shift. $200 closer to the security deposit she needed. $200 closer to an apartment Marcus didn't have a key to. Carlo Gambino arrived at 5:50, as he always did, and Rose felt the familiar flutter of anxiety mixed with something else she refused to examine too closely. She prepared his espresso with meticulous care, her hands steady even as her pulse quickened. He noticed things other patrons didn't, asked questions other men wouldn't dare. And this morning, as she approached his table with his order, she saw his gaze sharpen with recognition of something she'd tried so desperately to hide. This morning, her carefully constructed performance was about to fail. Carlo Gambino had built an empire on the ability to read people. In his world, survival depended on identifying threats before they materialized, on recognizing weakness before competitors could exploit it, on seeing the truth beneath whatever performance someone was selling. He'd been reading Rose Barkley for 8 months now, and what he saw troubled him more with each passing day. She was good at her job, exceptional, actually. She anticipated needs before patrons voiced them, moved through the dining room with fluid efficiency, never forgot a preference or a name. But it was the things she didn't do that caught his attention. She never made direct eye contact for more than a second. She never laughed fully, even when other staff joked during quiet moments. She wore long sleeves regardless of weather, and on the rare occasions her cuffs rode up, Carlo glimpsed shadows on her skin that disappeared too quickly for him to be certain of what he'd seen. The morning after he'd confronted her about the bruise, Carlo arrived at Marchand's at his usual time, but with a decision already made. He'd spent the previous evening making phone calls, pulling threads, learning everything there was to know about Rose Barkley. 24 years old. No family in the city. Shared a one-bedroom apartment in a marginal neighborhood with Marcus Devlin, a construction worker with a sealed juvenile record, and 2 domestic disturbance calls that had gone nowhere because the complainant, Rose, had refused to press charges both times. Carlo knew men like Marcus Devlin, had grown up surrounded by them, had watched his own mother flinch at sudden movements and wear scarves in summer. He'd been 10 years old when he'd understood what the sounds from his parents' bedroom really meant, 12 when he'd tried to intervene and earned his first broken rib, 15 when he'd finally been big enough to make his father stop permanently. That particular sin still sat heavy on his soul, even if the priest who heard his confessions assured him some violence was righteous. He would not watch another woman disappear into that particular darkness. Not when he had the power to prevent it. Rose approached his table with his espresso, her smile professionally warm but her eyes carefully averted. "Good morning, Mr. Gambino. Your usual." "Good morning, Miss Barkley." He accepted the cup, but didn't release her from the interaction with his customary nod. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I overstepped." "It's fine," she said quickly, too quickly. "Really, there's nothing to apologize for." Nevertheless, Carlo reached into his wallet and extracted 5 crisp $100 bills, setting them on the table beside his espresso. "I hope this covers any discomfort I may have caused." Rose stared at the money, her expression shifting from confusion to something that looked like pain. "Mr. Gambino, I can't accept that. Your usual tip is more than generous. This is." "Consider it a bonus," he said smoothly, "for consistently excellent service. You make the best espresso in the city, Miss Barkley. That's worth acknowledging." He watched her internal struggle play across her face. Pride warring with desperation. The money represented what? 2 weeks of rent? A month of groceries? He knew exactly how much power $500 held when someone was counting pennies. "Thank you," she finally whispered, her hand trembling slightly as she collected the bills. "That's very kind of you. May I ask you something, Miss Barkley?" Her shoulders tensed. "Of course." "Have you always lived in the city?" The question seemed to catch her off guard.
No, sir.
"I grew up in Virginia. Came here about 3 years ago." "Family back home?" "My grandmother. She raised me after my parents passed." "You must miss her." Something flickered in Rose's eyes, genuine emotion breaking through the professional mask. "Every day." "Does she know how you're doing here? That you're thriving?" The word, thriving, hung between them, laden with meaning. Rose's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I tell her I'm doing well. She worries enough as it is." Carlo nodded slowly, filing away the information. A grandmother in Virginia who believed Rose was safe and successful. No one in the city who knew the truth of her situation. No support network, no escape plan visible to the outside world. Marcus Devlin had isolated her perfectly. "I'm sure she's proud of you," Carlo said. "You've built a good life here." "I'm trying to," Rose said quietly, and the honesty in those 4 words told Carlo everything he needed to know about her awareness of her own situation. Over the next week, Carlo refined his approach. He arrived 5 minutes earlier each day, extending their morning interactions by small increments. He asked careful questions about her schedule, her commute, her plans for advancement. Never anything too personal, never anything that would send her retreating behind professional courtesy, but enough to map the boundaries of her life. He learned she worked doubles on Thursdays, that she walked home because she couldn't afford the bus fare, that she dreamed of eventually attending culinary school but dismissed it as unrealistic. He increased his tips incrementally, $200 one morning, $300 the next. Enough to matter, not enough to seem like charity or obligation. And he watched her carefully catalog each bill, saw the desperate hope in her eyes as she added the money to whatever fund she was building in secret. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after their first conversation, Carlo made his move. "Miss Barkley, I have a business proposition for you." Rose froze in the act of clearing his table. "Sir, I'm hosting a private dinner next month. 20 guests, very particular palates. I need someone who understands service at the highest level to manage the front of house. The compensation would be substantial, $5,000 for one evening's work." $5,000. He saw the number hit her like a physical force. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "Why me?" "Because you're the best at what you do," Carlo said simply. "And because I believe in investing in people who have the discipline and grace to excel under pressure. You have both." "That's very generous, Mr. Gambino, but I need to check with my—" She caught herself. "With my schedule. Make sure I can get the evening off." "Not with my boyfriend. With her schedule." Another piece of information, another window into how carefully she navigated her captivity. "Of course," Carlo said. "Think about it. The offer stands." He left $600 on the table that morning and didn't miss the way Rose's hand shook as she collected it, the way she glanced toward the door, as if Marcus Devlin might materialize and demand to know where the money came from. Carlo made a mental note to have his security detail begin surveillance on her apartment building. Not close enough to be noticed, but close enough to respond if circumstances required intervention. Rose Barkley might not know it yet, but she had just acquired the most dangerous kind of protection, the attention of a man who had already decided she was worth saving and who had the resources to make that decision stick, regardless of who stood in the way. Rose stood outside the apartment door for 30 seconds before inserting her key, listening. The television was on. She could hear the aggressive commentary of whatever sports broadcast Marcus was watching. That could be good or bad. Good if the game was going well, if his team was winning, if he'd had just enough beer to mellow him out. Bad if they were losing, if he'd had too much to drink, if something at work had gone wrong, and he was looking for a target. She couldn't stand in the hallway forever. Mrs. Patterson across the hall would peek through her peephole eventually, and Marcus hated when the neighbors paid attention to their comings and goings. Rose unlocked the door and stepped inside, her senses immediately cataloging everything. 3 empty beer bottles on the coffee table, the apartment stuffy with trapped heat, Marcus sprawled on the couch in his work clothes still, boots kicked off but socks leaving dirt marks on the cushions she'd cleaned just yesterday. "You're late," he said without looking away from the television. Rose checked her phone. 2:47 p.m. Her shift had ended at 2:30. The bus was running behind schedule. "I got here as fast as I could." "That what you're calling it now? The bus?" Marcus finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes tracking her movement as she set her purse on the counter. "Funny, because I drove past Marchand's around 2 and saw you standing outside talking to some guy in a suit." Rose's stomach dropped. The man in the suit had been Mr. Henderson, a regular who'd asked her opinion on anniversary restaurants for his wife. A 30-second conversation on the sidewalk while she waited for her bus. But explaining that would sound like making excuses, and Marcus hated excuses. A customer asked me a question, she said carefully, keeping her voice neutral. It would have been rude not to answer.
Right.
A customer. Marcus stood up, and Rose registered his height, the way he seemed to fill the small living room. You think I'm stupid, Rose? You think I don't notice you've been different lately? I haven't been different. I've been working. Yeah, at that fancy-ass place with all those rich men leaving you big tips. He crossed the room, stopping just inside her personal space. You come home with hundreds of dollars some days now. That seem normal to you? You think those men are paying you that much just to bring them coffee? Rose forced herself to meet his eyes, to not show the fear that was clawing up her throat. The clientele at Marchand's tips well. That's why I took the job. So we could save money, get ahead a little. We, Marcus repeated, his voice mocking. That's funny, because I haven't seen much of this money you're supposedly making. You got a new purse last week. New shoes. Where's all this extra cash going, Rose? The purse had been $15 at a thrift store, the shoes bought because her old ones had worn through. But Marcus was building a narrative, and facts wouldn't dismantle it. I put most of it in our savings account. You can check the statements. Our savings account, he said softly, dangerously. The one you opened in just your name? The one I don't have access to. Rose's pulse hammered. She'd opened that account precisely because she knew this conversation would eventually happen, knew that Marcus would find a way to take whatever she saved if he could access it. That's not. I opened it for us. I was going to add you to it once we had enough saved for the security deposit on a better place. The lie came smoothly, years of practice making her good at inventing plausible reasons for self-protective choices. Marcus studied her face, looking for cracks in her story, and Rose held perfectly still under his scrutiny. This was the dance they did, the careful choreography of his suspicion and her deflection, and one wrong step could turn this from interrogation into something worse. You've been acting different, Marcus said finally.
Jumpy.
Secretive. Coming home and going straight to the shower, like you're washing something off. You think I don't notice? I work in a restaurant, Marcus. I smell like food and coffee. Of course I shower. Don't get smart with me. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist hard enough to make her gasp. I'm not one of those rich assholes you smile at all day. I know you, Rose. I know when you're lying. Rose went still, letting her body go loose and non-threatening the way she'd learned to do. Fighting back only made it worse. Arguing only gave him justification. I'm not lying to you. I've been tired, that's all. The double shifts are hard on me. Marcus held her wrist a moment longer, his thumb pressing into the exact spot where he'd grabbed her 3 days ago, reopening the pain. Then he released her, shoving her hand away. Maybe you should quit that job. Come back to the diner where I can see you during the day, where you're not around all those men with money. Terror flooded through Rose, cold and absolute. Quit Marchand's? Go back to making $8 an hour plus minimal tips? Lose the escape fund she'd been building, the progress she'd made, the one thing giving her hope? Marcus, we need this income. The diner wouldn't pay nearly as much. We'd barely make rent. We made rent fine before. Because I was working 60-hour weeks and destroying my feet. This job is better. Please, I'm just trying to help us. The word please hung in the air, and Rose hated herself for the pleading tone in her voice, for the way she was begging to keep the one piece of autonomy she had left. Marcus seemed to sense her desperation, and something calculating entered his expression.
Fine. Keep the job.
But things are going to change around here. He stepped closer again, his hand coming up to grip her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. No more late nights. No more chatting with customers. You do your job, and you come straight home. And that savings account? You're going to add me to it. Tomorrow. Rose's mind raced. If he had access to her account, he'd drain it within a week. She'd be back to zero, back to being trapped with no escape route. Of course, she heard herself say. I'll go to the bank on my lunch break tomorrow.
She wouldn't, obviously.
She'd move the money somewhere else, open a new account he couldn't find. But right now she needed to agree, needed to defuse this situation before his grip on her chin became a hand around her throat. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then released her. Good. Now make me something to eat. I've been waiting for you to get home for an hour. Rose moved toward the kitchen, her wrist throbbing, her chin aching where his fingers had dug in. She pulled leftover chicken from the refrigerator, began reheating it on the stove, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind worked frantically. She couldn't quit Marchand's. She couldn't give Marcus access to her money. But defying him openly would end with her in the emergency room again, or worse. She thought of Carlo Gambino's dark eyes, the way he'd looked at her bruises with something that resembled fury held in careful check. The $5,000 job offer he'd extended, enough money to disappear completely if she was smart about it. But accepting help from a man like Carlo felt like trading one cage for another, and Rose had learned the hard way that men who seemed protective at first could turn possessive once they felt you belonged to them. Rose, Marcus called from the living room. Beer's empty. Coming, she called back, reaching for the refrigerator. She would figure this out. She had to. Because the alternative, staying in this apartment, under Marcus's increasingly paranoid scrutiny, while whatever opportunities Carlo was offering slipped away, felt like watching her own slow death. And Rose Barkley had not survived this long by giving up when things got difficult. She'd survived by being smarter, more patient, more disciplined than the people trying to control her. She just had to stay alive long enough for that patience to pay off. Carlo arrived 15 minutes earlier than usual on Monday morning, when Marchand's was still empty except for kitchen staff, and the new bruise on Rose's wrist had darkened to deep purple despite her long sleeves. He saw it when she reached for his espresso cup, the fabric riding up just enough to reveal what she'd tried to hide. "Miss Barkley," he said quietly, "would you sit with me for a moment? Before the morning rush begins." Rose glanced toward the kitchen, her body language screaming reluctance. "Mr. Gambino, I should really, please, 5 minutes." There was something in his tone that made it impossible to refuse, not a command but a request weighted with enough gravity that Rose found herself sliding into the booth across from him. She kept her hands in her lap, hidden beneath the table, her posture perfectly straight despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. Carlo studied her for a long moment, then did something Rose had never seen him do in 8 months of service. He rolled up his left sleeve, exposing his forearm. 3 long scars ran from his wrist to his elbow, old but unmistakable, the kind of defensive wounds someone got when they raised their arm to protect their face. "I was 15, Carlo said, his voice devoid of emotion. "My father came home drunk, angrier than usual. My mother was in the kitchen. I heard the sound of glass breaking, heard her cry out, and I made a decision that night that I would not make her bury a son before I buried him." He traced one of the scars with his opposite hand. He had a broken bottle. "I had youth and desperation. It was not a fair fight, but then it was never meant to be." Rose stared at the scars, her throat tight. "Did you kill him?"
No.
"Though I considered it." Carlo rolled his sleeve back down with deliberate precision. "I put him in the hospital for 3 weeks. When he came home, he never raised his hand to her again. Or to me. He knew what I was capable of, and more importantly, he knew I would not hesitate a second time. Why are you telling me this? Because I recognize a war zone when I see one, Miss Barkley. I grew up in one. I understand the calculations you make every morning when you wake up, how to minimize damage, how to avoid escalation, how to survive another day by making yourself small and invisible. Carlo leaned forward slightly. I also understand the point where survival is no longer enough, where you realize that living like this is just dying slowly. Rose's hands trembled beneath the table. I don't know what you think you see. I see a woman who is running out of time, Carlo interrupted, his voice gentle but unyielding. I see someone who has been planning an escape, but whose captor is growing more paranoid, more controlling. I see someone who understands that the window for leaving safely is closing. The accuracy of his assessment terrified her more than any threat could have. Even if that were true, what would you suggest I do? Walk out? Men like she caught herself. Men in situations like that don't just let you leave. No, Carlo agreed. They don't. Which is why you need resources beyond your own. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small black card, setting it on the table between them. It was matte finish, expensive looking, with only a phone number embossed in gold and a single word, Sentinel. This is a private security firm, Carlo explained. The kind that specializes in extraction and protection. You call that number, you say my name, and within 30 minutes you will have professionals who can remove you from any situation, place you in secure housing, and ensure that the person threatening you understands that continuing to do so would be extremely unwise. Rose stared at the card like it might explode. I can't afford something like that. You are not being asked to. I have a standing arrangement with them. The card is already activated in your name, Rose Barkley, 24 years old, residing at 847 Morrison Avenue, apartment 3B. The fact that he knew her exact address should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like confirmation that someone in the world was paying attention, that she was not as invisible as she'd believed. Why would you do this for me? Because I failed to do it for my mother, Carlo said simply. Because I watched her live in fear for 15 years before I was old enough to stop it. Because I built my life on the understanding that power is meaningless if you do not use it to protect people who cannot protect themselves. You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you are intelligent, disciplined, and stronger than you believe yourself to be. I know you deserve better than what you are currently enduring. And I know that if something happens to you, because I had the ability to help and chose not to, I will carry that burden for the rest of my life. Rose picked up the card with shaking fingers, feeling the weight of it, the implied promise. If I use this, what would you want from me in return? Carlo's expression hardened slightly. That question tells me exactly how low your expectations have become, Miss Barkley. I want nothing from you. This is not a transaction. This is not the beginning of an obligation. This is simply a tool, available if and when you need it. Men like you don't give away resources for free. Men like me understand that real power is not hoarded, it is deployed strategically. Helping you costs me nothing and benefits me by removing a threat to someone under my informal protection.
He paused.
Though I will admit to a secondary motivation. I do not enjoy watching good people suffer when I have the means to prevent it. Call it a character flaw. Rose turned the card over in her hands, memorizing the number, even as part of her brain calculated the risks. If she called this number, she would be accepting help from Carlo Gambino, stepping into his sphere of influence. But if she didn't, if Marcus's paranoia continued to escalate, she might not live long enough to use the escape fund she'd been building. The offer has no expiration date, Carlo said, reading her hesitation.
Keep the card.
Use it if you need it. Throw it away if you do not. The choice is entirely yours, Miss Barkley. But know this, I have already instructed Sentinel to prioritize any call that comes from the number associated with that card. If you need help, it will arrive. Quickly. Rose slipped the card into her pocket, feeling it settle against her phone like a small weight, a possibility she had not possessed 10 minutes ago. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me yet. Thank me when you are safe, on your own terms, in a life you chose rather than one you were trapped in." Carlo glanced at his watch. "Your morning shift is about to begin. I will take my usual table, and we will not speak of this again unless you choose to initiate the conversation." Rose stood, her legs unsteady, and returned to her position behind the service counter. She prepared Carlo's espresso with her usual precision, served it with her professional courtesy, and accepted his generous tip with a murmured thanks. To any observer, it was simply another morning at Marchand's bistro, another interaction between a valued patron and his preferred server. But in Rose's pocket, the black card burned like a promise, like a weapon, like the first real choice she'd had in 3 years. And for the first time since Marcus had shown her who he really was, Rose allowed herself to imagine a future where she was not afraid. Rose found the Sentinel card on Thursday evening when she was doing laundry. She'd forgotten it was in her uniform pocket, and it fell onto the bathroom floor just as Marcus walked past the open door. "What's that?" he asked, stopping. Rose's mind went blank with terror for half a second before survival instinct kicked in. A business card. One of the customers left it on a table. I was supposed to throw it away. She bent to pick it up, but Marcus was faster, snatching it from the tile. He turned the black card over, reading the embossed number. Sentinel. What kind of business just has a phone number? I don't know. Security company, maybe? Rich people have cards for everything. Rose kept her voice casual, dismissive, praying he would lose interest. Marcus pulled out his phone and typed something. Rose watched his face change as he read whatever came up on his screen, watched suspicion harden into rage. It's a protection service. For people who need bodyguards and safe houses. His eyes snapped to hers. Why the hell do you have a card for a protection service, Rose? I told you. A customer left it. Don't lie to me. His hand shot out, gripping her throat, slamming her back against the bathroom wall hard enough that her vision blurred. These services cost thousands of dollars. You don't just find their cards lying around. Someone gave this to you.
Who?
Rose clawed at his hand, unable to breathe, unable to speak even if she'd wanted to. Marcus's face was inches from hers, his breath hot and reeking of beer, his eyes wild with the kind of fury she'd learned meant real danger. Was it that guy in a suit? The one you're always smiling at? The one who tips you hundreds of dollars? Marcus's grip tightened. Have you been fucking him, Rose? Is that where all this money is coming from? Black spots danced at the edges of Rose's vision. She tried to shake her head, tried to communicate that she couldn't breathe, but Marcus seemed beyond rational thought. His free hand drew back, formed a fist, and Rose thought with strange clarity that this was it. This was how it would end, beaten to death in a bathroom that still smelled like cheap bleach. Then something in Marcus's expression shifted. He released her throat and Rose collapsed to the floor, gasping, coughing, her hands going instinctively to her neck. Marcus stood over her, his chest heaving, the Sentinel card crushed in his fist. You're not leaving, he said, his voice eerily calm now. You think I'm stupid? You've been planning it. Saving money, making connections with rich men who can help you disappear. But you're not leaving, Rose. You belong to me. He grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet, dragging her into the bedroom. Rose's throat burned, her vision still spotty, but she registered the sound of the closet door opening, of Marcus pulling out the old duffel bag where he kept his tools. I was going to wait, Marcus said conversationally, rifling through the bag. give you more time to come to your senses. But you've made it clear you don't respect what we have here. You don't appreciate everything I've done for you. He pulled something from the bag and Rose's blood turned to ice. Zip ties. The heavy-duty kind used in construction. Marcus, please. Shut up. He grabbed her wrists, securing them together with brutal efficiency despite her struggles. You're going to call in sick tomorrow. And the day after. You're going to quit that fancy job, and you're going to remember who you belong to. He zip-tied her ankles next, then fastened her bound wrists to the bed frame with a third tie. Rose pulled against the restraints, panic overwhelming rational thought. Marcus, you can't do this. People will notice I'm missing. My manager will. Your manager will get a text from your phone saying you quit. Family emergency back in Virginia. Marcus smiled, a horrible expression that held no warmth. And by the time anyone thinks to check on you, you'll have learned your place again. He left her there, turning off the bedroom light as he went. Rose heard the television turn on in the living room, heard the crack of another beer opening. She pulled at the zip ties until her wrists bled, but they didn't budge. The plastic bit into her skin, her shoulders screamed from the awkward angle, and her throat throbbed where his hands had crushed her windpipe. This was it. This was the point Carlo had warned her about, the moment where survival was no longer possible through submission and patience. Marcus had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and Rose understood with terrible clarity that he would not let her leave this apartment alive. She had to get free, had to get to her phone, had to call the number on that black card before Marcus decided that restraining her wasn't enough, before his paranoia convinced him that the only way to keep her was to make sure she could never run. Rose twisted her wrists, ignoring the pain, feeling for any weakness in the ties. Nothing. She tried to slip her hands through, but Marcus had secured them too tightly. She looked around the bedroom in the dim light from the living room, searching for anything sharp, anything she could use. The lamp on the nightstand. If she could reach it, knock it over, break the bulb, and use the glass. Marcus appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. Stop moving. You're just making it worse for yourself. Rose went still, her heart hammering. Please, Marcus.
Please don't do this.
I'll stay. I'll do whatever you want. Just untie me. You'll stay because you don't have a choice anymore. He walked to the bed, looking down at her with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been regret. I should have done this months ago. Kept you where you couldn't get ideas about leaving. He reached out and Rose flinched, but he only brushed hair away from her face with unexpected gentleness. This is your fault, Rose. You made me do this. If you'd just been happy with what we had, if you hadn't started thinking you were too good for me, none of this would be necessary. Then he left again, closing the bedroom door behind him. Rose heard the lock click, heard his footsteps retreat down the hall. She pulled at the restraints until exhaustion forced her to stop, her wrists raw and bleeding, her shoulders on fire. At some point, she must have passed out because she woke to sunlight filtering through the blinds and the realization that she'd missed her opening shift at Marchand's. Carlo would notice. He always noticed. Rose clung to that thought like a lifeline as she heard Marcus moving around the apartment, as the hours crawled past and her body screamed with pain and thirst. Carlo would notice she hadn't shown up. Carlo had given her the Sentinel card, had told her help would come quickly. But her phone was in the living room, and she was tied to a bed frame, and Carlo had no way of knowing that the window for rescue had already closed, that Rose Barkley was no longer a woman planning an escape, but a prisoner counting the hours until her captor decided she wasn't worth keeping alive anymore. Carlo knew something was wrong the moment Rose failed to appear for her opening shift. In 8 months, she had never been late, never missed a day, never deviated from the precise reliability that marked her as someone who understood that survival depended on consistency. When 6 a.m. came and went without her preparing his espresso, Carlo made 3 phone calls. The first was to the surveillance team he'd positioned near Rose's apartment building. They confirmed Marcus Devlin had not left for his construction job that morning, that his truck remained parked outside, that the apartment lights had stayed on all night. The second call was to Sentinel, activating the emergency extraction protocol he'd established when he gave Rose the card. The third was to his attorney, instructing him to handle whatever legal complications might arise from what Carlo was about to do. By 6:30 a.m., Carlo was in the back of his town car with 4 Sentinel operatives in tactical gear, heading toward Morrison Avenue. He'd changed from his usual suit into dark clothing that wouldn't show blood, and the Glock holstered at his side felt both familiar and necessary. This was not a business negotiation. This was a rescue operation, and Carlo had learned decades ago that some situations required violence to resolve. The apartment building was a 3-story walk-up in a neighborhood where people knew better than to look too closely at things that didn't concern them. Carlo's team entered through the side entrance, their movements silent and professional. 2 operatives secured the stairwell while Carlo and the other 2 approached apartment 3B. Carlo knocked once, firm but not aggressive. Marcus Devlin. Open the door. Silence, then footsteps. The door cracked open 6 inches, held by a chain lock. Marcus peered out, his eyes widening with recognition, then narrowing with hostility. "The hell are you doing here?" "I'm here for Rose Barkley. You're going to let me in, or my associates are going to make entry by force. Your choice." Marcus tried to slam the door, but Carlo's shoulder hit it first, snapping the chain and sending Marcus stumbling backward. The 2 Sentinel operatives followed Carlo inside, their weapons drawn but not pointed, their presence alone enough to make Marcus raise his hands. "You can't just break into my home," Marcus said, his voice high with panic and indignation. "I'll call the cops. You'll do nothing," Carlo said quietly, his gaze sweeping the apartment until he located the closed bedroom door. "Where is she?" "I don't know what you're talking about. Rose isn't here." Carlo crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed Marcus by the throat, and slammed him against the wall with enough force to rattle the cheap fixtures. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and if you lie to me again, I will break every bone in your hand before I move on to larger bones."
Where is she?
Marcus's face paled. "Bedroom. She's in the bedroom. But she's mine. You can't just..." Carlo released him with a shove of disgust and moved to the bedroom door. It was locked from the outside. He kicked it open, the frame splintering, and the sight that greeted him ignited a rage so profound that for a moment Carlo couldn't see anything except the memory of his mother, bound and bleeding, while his father explained why she'd made him do it. Rose was zip-tied to the bed frame, her wrists raw and bloodied from struggling, her throat mottled with bruises in the distinctive pattern of strangulation, her eyes glazed with pain and dehydration. She looked up as Carlo entered, and the relief that flooded her expression nearly broke something in him. "I've got you," Carlo said, his voice gentler than he'd known he could make it. He pulled a tactical knife from his belt and cut through the zip ties with precise efficiency. Rose's arms dropped, and she gasped with pain as circulation returned.
"Easy.
Don't try to move too quickly." "My phone," Rose whispered, her voice ragged. "He has my phone. He was going to. I know what he was going to do. We're leaving now." Carlo lifted her carefully, mindful of her injuries, and carried her out of the bedroom. Marcus was still against the wall, held in place by one of the Sentinel operatives. His eyes went wide as he saw Rose in Carlo's arms. "You can't take her. She's my girlfriend. This is kidnapping." Carlo paused, turning to look at Marcus with an expression that made the younger man shrink back. "You tied a woman to a bed and left her to die slowly. The only reason I'm not killing you right now is because she doesn't need that trauma added to everything else you've done to her. But understand this clearly, Mr. Devlin. If you make any attempt to contact Rose, if you file a police report, if you so much as speak her name in public, I will find you. And what I do to you will make what you did to her look merciful by comparison. You can't threaten me, Marcus said, but his voice shook. That wasn't a threat. That was a promise. Carlo nodded to his operative. Make sure he understands. Carlo carried Rose out of the apartment and down the stairs while behind him, he heard the operative explaining to Marcus in clinical detail exactly what organization Carlo represented and what happened to people who crossed that organization. By the time Carlo reached his car, Marcus would understand that Rose Barkley was untouchable and that pursuing her would be suicide. Rose trembled in Carlo's arms as he settled her into the back seat of the town car. A female sentinel medic was already there, opening a medical kit. Let her look at your injuries, Carlo instructed. We're taking you somewhere safe. Where? Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. My estate outside the city. 20 acres, full security, medical staff on site. You'll have your own suite, complete privacy, and time to heal. I can't afford. You're not being asked to afford anything. Your old life ended the moment you stepped into this car, Miss Barkley. You don't go back to that apartment. You don't contact Marcus Devlin. You don't return to Marchand's bistro. Panic flashed across Rose's face. But my job, my things. I've already handled your employment situation. Your manager has been compensated generously for your immediate resignation and has agreed to lose any personnel records that might make you easy to track. Your belongings will be collected by my staff and brought to the estate. Your bank account will be transferred to a new institution under enhanced security. Carlo's tone softened slightly. I know this is overwhelming. I know you're frightened. But right now, you need to trust that I have your best interests in mind. Rose stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for something, deception, ulterior motive, the catch that surely had to exist. Why are you doing this? Because I told you I would. Because power is meaningless if you don't use it to protect people who need protection. Because you deserve better than dying slowly in a one-bedroom apartment at the hands of a man who mistook ownership for love. Carlo held her gaze. And because I have the resources to make you safe, and choosing not to use them would make me complicit in whatever happened to you next. The medic finished her initial assessment, wrapping Rose's wrists in gauze and offering her water. Rose drank greedily, then leaned back against the leather seat, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. Thank you, she whispered. Save your thanks for when you've decided whether this is actually what you want, Carlo said. Right now, you're in shock and grateful to be alive. Tomorrow, you might resent me for making decisions on your behalf. That's your right. But for today, you're safe. And that's what matters. The car pulled away from Morrison Avenue, leaving behind the apartment where Rose Barkley had almost died, carrying her toward a future she hadn't dared to imagine. In the rearview mirror, Carlo saw Marcus Devlin stumble out onto the sidewalk, watching the car disappear, and Carlo felt a grim satisfaction knowing the man understood exactly how powerless he'd become. Rose Barkley was no longer his to hurt. She was under Carlo Gambino's protection now, and in the world Carlo inhabited, that protection was absolute. The estate was nothing like Rose had imagined. She'd pictured something ostentatious, all marble columns and gold fixtures, the kind of wealth that announced itself aggressively. Instead, Carlo's property was quietly elegant, a stone manor house surrounded by manicured gardens and oak trees, with security so discreet she only noticed the cameras because she'd learned to look for them. Her suite occupied the entire east wing. Bedroom, sitting room, private bathroom with a tub large enough to drown in, and a small balcony overlooking a pond where ducks glided across still water. The closet had been stocked with clothes in her size, expensive but understated, the kind of garments she'd admired in shop windows, but never imagined wearing. There were books on the shelves, art supplies in the sitting room, and a phone on the nightstand with a single number programmed in, Carlo's direct line. For the first 3 days, Rose barely left the bedroom. Her body was healing. The estate physician had examined her injuries with professional detachment, prescribed pain medication and antibiotics for the infected rope burns on her wrists, but her mind felt fractured. She'd wake from nightmares about zip ties and Marcus's hands around her throat, only to remember she was safe, and then feel crushing shame that safety had required someone else's intervention. She'd failed. That was the thought that circled her mind during those first days. Failed to save herself. Failed to be strong enough or smart enough to escape on her own terms. She'd needed rescuing like some damsel in a story, and the man who'd rescued her was a criminal who could destroy her as easily as he'd protected her. On the 4th day, Carlo knocked on her suite door during breakfast. Rose had been eating on the balcony, picking at scrambled eggs while watching the ducks. She almost didn't answer, ashamed to face him, but his patience was evident in the way he waited without knocking again. "Come in," she finally called. Carlo entered carrying a leather portfolio, dressed casually in dark slacks and a white shirt, looking less like a Mafia boss and more like someone's elegant older brother. "I wanted to check on you. The staff says you've been keeping to your room." "I'm fine. Just tired." Rose set down her fork, unable to meet his eyes. "You're not fine, Miss Barkley. You're recovering from trauma, and that's not the same thing." Carlo settled into the chair across from her, setting the portfolio on the table. "May I speak plainly?" Rose nodded, her throat tight. "I suspect you're struggling with the circumstances of your rescue. That you feel diminished by having needed help, that you're waiting for me to present a bill for my assistance, that you're wondering what price I'll eventually extract for your freedom." Carlo's voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. "These are rational concerns given what you've experienced, but they're also incorrect." "How can you know what I'm thinking?" "Because I've seen this before. Because my mother felt the same shame after I intervened with my father. She apologized constantly, tried to make herself useful around the house, couldn't accept that I'd acted out of love rather than expectation of repayment." Carlo leaned forward slightly. "Let me be clear about something. You are a guest here, not a prisoner. You are not obligated to me. You owe me nothing. When you're ready to leave, you'll leave. What happens next is entirely your decision." Rose finally met his eyes. "But you broke into an apartment. You threatened Marcus. You ended my employment without asking me. How is that my decision?" "Fair question. Let me rephrase. What happens from this moment forward is your decision. I made choices during an emergency when you were physically incapable of making them yourself. I would make those same choices again, because the alternative was your death. But your recovery, your future, your autonomy, those belong to you alone. I don't understand what you want from me. I want you to heal. That's all." Carlo opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents. "These are educational program catalogs. Culinary schools, university degree programs, vocational training. You mentioned once that you'd considered culinary school but dismissed it as unrealistic. I'd like you to reconsider. Choose something that interests you, and I'll handle the tuition and expenses." Rose stared at the catalogs. "Why would you do that?" "Because education is power, Miss Barkley. Because you're intelligent and capable, and you deserve the opportunity to build a life based on your talents rather than your circumstances. Because helping you become self-sufficient is far more valuable than keeping you dependent. What if I choose something expensive? What if I take your money and then leave? Then you'll have an education and a better future, and I'll be satisfied that I used my resources wisely. Carlo's expression was serious. I'm not your father, Miss Barkley. I'm not Marcus Devlin. I don't need to control you to feel powerful. Your success doesn't diminish me. It validates the choice I made to help you. Rose picked up one of the catalogs, her hands trembling. A culinary institute in the city. Professional programs, degree tracks, student housing. The kind of future she'd stopped letting herself want. I don't know if I can do this. If I'm strong enough. You survived 3 years with a man who tried to break you. You maintained your dignity, your work ethic, your essential self. You're stronger than you believe, Miss Barkley. You simply haven't had the space to recognize it yet. Over the following weeks, Rose began to emerge from her suite. She explored the estate grounds, discovering a greenhouse full of herbs and vegetables, a library that rivaled small-town collections, a kitchen where the estate chef welcomed her curiosity about technique and ingredients. She applied to 3 culinary programs and was accepted to all of them. She chose the institute in the city, the one with the rigorous professional track and competitive reputation. Carlo appeared at dinner occasionally, always by invitation, never imposing his presence. They talked about food, about books, about Rose's grandmother in Virginia, who still believed Rose was thriving at Marchand's Bistro. Carlo arranged for Rose to call her grandmother, to explain she'd changed jobs and moved to a better apartment, lies that felt necessary to protect an elderly woman from worry. 6 weeks into her recovery, Rose found Carlo in the library one evening. I need to talk to you about something. Of course. Rose sat across from him, her posture straighter than it had been weeks ago, her eyes clearer. I start culinary school in 2 weeks. I've been thinking about what comes after that, and I realized something. I can't stay here indefinitely. Not because you've made me uncomfortable, you haven't, but because I need to prove to myself that I can survive independently, that I'm not trading one form of protection for another. Carlo nodded slowly. I understand. What do you need? Help finding an apartment. Something modest but safe. Help with the first few months of rent while I find part-time work around my class schedule. And then nothing. I need to build my life myself.
Done.
I'll have my assistant compile a list of suitable properties by tomorrow. Carlo met her eyes. For what it's worth, Miss Barkley, I'm proud of you. Not for needing help, that's human, but for recognizing when you're ready to reclaim your independence. That takes more courage than most people possess. Rose felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of shame and fear that had been choking her since the extraction. Thank you. For everything. For saving my life. For not expecting anything in return. For giving me space to remember who I am. You never forgot who you were, Carlo said quietly. You just survived circumstances that required you to hide her for a while. Welcome back, Miss Barkley. That night, Rose slept without nightmares for the first time in years. She dreamed instead of kitchens full of light, of her own apartment with locks only she controlled, of a future where Rose Barkley was not defined by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to become. Rose moved into her new apartment on a Tuesday morning in early September, 3 months after Carlo had carried her out of Marcus Devlin's apartment. The space was small, a studio in a secure building with a doorman and cameras in every hallway, but it was hers. Her name on the lease, her key in the lock, her decisions about what went where, and when she came and went. Carlo's team had helped with the logistics, moving her belongings from the estate and ensuring the building management understood that Rose Barkley's privacy was paramount and that any suspicious inquiries about her should be reported immediately. But Carlo himself had stayed away, respecting the boundary Rose had drawn when she told him she needed to do this part alone. The Culinary Institute was everything Rose had hoped for and more demanding than she'd anticipated. She attended classes 6 hours a day, learning knife skills and sauce preparations and the precise chemistry of baking. She worked part-time at a small neighborhood bistro 3 evenings a week, earning her own money again, rebuilding the sense of self-sufficiency that Marcus had systematically destroyed. The tips weren't as generous as they'd been at Marchand's, but Rose didn't care. Every dollar she earned felt like proof that she could survive on her own terms. 6 weeks into her independence, Carlo called. Rose had been expecting it, had been waiting for it with a mixture of anticipation and dread, but his voice on the phone still made her pulse quicken in a way she wasn't ready to examine. "Miss Barkley, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. I just finished my evening shift." Rose settled onto her small couch, looking out at the city lights through her window. "How are you?"
Well, busy.
"The usual complications of running multiple enterprises." A pause. "I've been following your progress. Your instructors speak highly of your work." Rose felt a flicker of irritation. "You've been checking on me? I've been ensuring you're safe. There's a difference." Carlo's tone was unapologetic but not defensive. "Marcus Devlin remains in the city. He's been questioned by police about unrelated matters, and my sources indicate he's asked about you several times. I wanted to confirm the security measures around your building were sufficient." The mention of Marcus sent ice through Rose's veins, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Has he tried to find me?"
No.
"He understands the consequences of doing so. But I don't trust that understanding to last indefinitely, which is why I maintain awareness of his movements." Carlo let that settle. "That's not why I called, however. I wanted to ask if you'd have dinner with me. Not at my estate. Not anywhere connected to my business. Just dinner, as two people who know each other, to celebrate your progress." Rose's breath caught. She'd been thinking about Carlo constantly since leaving the estate, the way he'd given her space, the way he'd protected her without demanding gratitude, the way his dark eyes had looked at her with something that felt like respect rather than possession. But she'd also been terrified that her gratitude would be mistaken for something else, that whatever she felt for Carlo Gambino was contaminated by the circumstances of their meeting. "I don't think that's a good idea," Rose said quietly. Silence on the line. Then, "May I ask why?" "Because I'm not ready. Because I need to know that I can stand on my own before I consider standing beside anyone. Because..." Rose took a breath. "Because you saved my life, Carlo. And I'm grateful. But I can't be with you out of gratitude. I won't be with anyone out of obligation or dependency or because they have power over my circumstances." "I would never want that," Carlo said, and there was something raw in his voice that Rose had never heard before. "Miss Barkley Rose, I'm not asking you to be with me. I'm asking to spend an evening in your company, to talk to someone I find remarkable, to get to know the woman you're becoming now that you have the freedom to become her. What if that woman is different from who you think she is? What if I disappoint you? Then I'll have learned something true about you, which is more valuable than maintaining an idealized image." Carlo paused. "I'm not Marcus. I'm not your father, or any other man who needed you to be small so they could feel large. Your independence doesn't threaten me. It interests me. The fact that you're strong enough to tell me no is exactly why I want to know you better." Rose closed her eyes, feeling tears prick at the corners. "I need more time." "Then take it. I'm not going anywhere." His voice gentled. "But Rose, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I want you to know that I see you. Not the woman I rescued. Not someone I feel responsible for. I see the person who survived 3 years of hell and came out with her humanity intact. I see the student who stays late in the kitchen perfecting techniques because excellence matters to her. I see someone worth knowing on her own merits, not because of what I did for her." "How do you know I stay late in the kitchen?" "Your instructor mentioned it when I called to verify your progress. Apparently you're driving the other students to distraction with your work ethic." There was a smile in Carlo's voice. She said, "You have the discipline of someone twice your age and the creativity of someone who learned to find joy in small things." Rose laughed despite herself, wiping at her eyes. She said that.
She did.
She also said you're too hard on yourself and that you flinch when people raise their voices, even in excitement. That you're healing but that the scars are still visible to anyone paying attention. You asked about all of this? I asked how you were doing. She told me the truth because she's perceptive and because she cares about her students. Carlo's voice grew serious. I need you to understand something, Rose. I'm not waiting for you to feel obligated to me. I'm not counting the days until I can collect on some imagined debt. I'm simply hoping that when you're ready, when you've built the life you want, you might consider letting me be part of it. Not as a savior. Not as someone you owe, but as someone you choose. Rose sat with that for a long moment, watching the city lights blur through her tears. Ask me again in 6 months. When I've finished the semester. When I've proven to myself that I can survive without anyone's help. 6 months, Carlo agreed. I'll mark my calendar. And Rose. Yes, I'm proud of you. Not for surviving that was forced on you, but for choosing to thrive. That's courage. After they hung up, Rose sat in her small apartment and let herself cry, not from sadness or fear, but from the overwhelming realization that for the first time in her adult life, she was choosing her own path. She was building her own future. And when she was ready, if she decided Carlo Gambino was someone she wanted in that future, it would be because she chose him, not because she needed him. The next morning, Rose woke early and went to class with renewed focus. She practiced her knife skills until her instructor nodded with approval. She developed a sauce recipe that made her chef teacher pause and taste it twice. She worked her evening shift with confidence, her tips going into the savings account that was hers alone, building toward goals she set herself. And 6 months later, when Carlo called again, Rose was ready. Not because she owed him, not because she was grateful, but because she'd spent half a year becoming someone she respected, and that woman had decided Carlo Gambino, with his quiet strength and his refusal to demand anything from her, was worth knowing better. She'd survived Marcus by becoming invisible. She'd healed at Carlo's estate by finding herself again. And now, standing on her own 2 feet, Rose Barkley could finally choose to let someone see her completely, knowing that her choice was freely made and that her independence would never be the price of being loved. Rose Gambino stood at the podium in the downtown conference center, addressing a room of 200 donors, advocates, and survivors. Her natural hair fell in elegant curls past her shoulders, and she wore a tailored navy suit that communicated both professionalism and power. The diamond on her left hand caught the light as she gestured, but it was her voice, clear, confident, unwavering, that commanded the room's attention. The Haven Project began with a simple premise, Rose said, her gaze sweeping across the audience. That no woman should have to choose between homelessness and violence. That safety should not require wealth or connections. That survival should be a baseline expectation, not a privilege. She paused, letting her words settle. In the past year, we've provided secure housing to 47 women and their children. We've funded job training programs, legal representation, and trauma counseling. We've created a network of support that extends beyond emergency extraction to long-term independence. Carlo sat in the front row, watching his wife with undisguised pride. She'd spent the past year building the Haven Project from concept to reality, leveraging Carlo's resources, but directing every decision herself. The organization bore her vision entirely, safe houses in undisclosed locations, staffed by professionals trained in trauma-informed care, with programs designed to move women from crisis to self-sufficiency within 18 months. Rose had insisted on including her own story in the organization's founding narrative. Not the details, those belonged to her, but the framework, that she understood firsthand what it meant to be trapped, to need help, and to fear that accepting help meant surrendering autonomy. That understanding informed every aspect of the Haven Project's approach. Many of you know my husband, Carlo Gambino, Rose continued, a slight smile touching her lips. Some of you may wonder if this project is simply his philanthropy, wearing a different face. Let me be clear, Carlo provided initial funding and security infrastructure because I asked him to. But the Haven Project is mine. The decisions are mine. The vision is mine. And any woman who enters our program will never be required to meet him, thank him, or acknowledge his contribution in any way. Because that's not what this is about. The room erupted in applause. Carlo joined in, catching Rose's eye across the distance. She gave him a small nod, acknowledgement between equals, before continuing her presentation. After the event, they drove together to Marchand's bistro. The manager had called weeks ago, asking if Rose would consider attending a small reception to honor her work. Rose had been hesitant. Returning to the place where her old life had ended felt complicated, but Carlo had encouraged her. "You're not the same woman who served coffee there," he'd said. "Show them who you've become." The bistro looked exactly as Rose remembered, all brass fixtures and white linen. But when she entered on Carlo's arm, the entire staff lined up to greet her, and the general manager, the same man who'd once warned her that Mr. Gambino's privacy was paramount, bowed slightly with genuine respect. "Mrs. Gambino, it's an honor to host you this evening. Your usual table is ready." Rose smiled at the phrasing. Her usual table. Not Carlo's corner booth, but the center table where everyone could see them, where Rose was clearly the guest of honor and Carlo the supportive spouse. They settled into their seats, and a young waitress approached, nervous, probably new, with careful movements that reminded Rose painfully of her younger self. The girl set down water glasses with hands that trembled slightly, and Rose noticed the way her sleeves were pulled down despite the warm evening, the way her eyes stayed carefully averted. "What's your name?" Rose asked gently. "Alicia, ma'am." "How long have you worked here, Alicia?" "For months, ma'am. I'm still learning the menu, so if you have questions I might need to check with." "You're doing beautifully," Rose interrupted. "I used to work here, actually. I know how demanding the clientele can be. You're handling it with grace." Alicia's eyes widened with recognition. She'd obviously heard the story of Rose Barkley, the waitress who'd married Carlo Gambino, and something like hope flickered across her face. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot." Rose pulled a business card from her purse, the Haven Project's logo embossed in silver. "If you ever need anything, job placement assistance, legal advice, a safe place to stay, you call this number. No questions asked. No judgment. Just help." Alicia took the card with shaking hands, her fingers brushing the embossed logo as if it were something precious. "Thank you," she whispered. After Alicia left to place their order, Carlo reached across the table and took Rose's hand. "You saw it immediately, didn't you? The signs. The long sleeves. The downcast eyes. The fear of making mistakes." Rose squeezed his hand. "I see it everywhere now. Once you've lived it, you recognize the performance." "Will she call?" "Maybe. Maybe not. Some women aren't ready. But now she knows there's a door if she needs it." Rose looked around the bistro, remembering the woman she'd been a year ago, exhausted, terrified, counting tips and praying for escape. "I was so small then, so focused on surviving that I couldn't imagine actually living." "You were never small," Carlo said quietly. "You were compressed. There's a difference. Small implies lacking substance. You had substance, you simply didn't have space to expand into it. Rose felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears. Tears that came from being understood completely by someone who'd proven time and again that he saw her as she truly was. Thank you for giving me that space. For not requiring gratitude or submission. For letting me find myself again before you asked me to share that self with you. Thank you for choosing me once you found yourself. For trusting that I would cherish your strength rather than fear it. Carlo raised her hand to his lips. You've built something remarkable, Rose. Not just the Haven Project, but the life you're living. You could have let what Marcus did define you. Instead, you've let it refine you. Their dinner arrived, prepared by a chef who'd sent word that Mrs. Gambino's meal was compliments of the house. They ate slowly, talking about the Haven Project's expansion plans, about the 3 women currently in the program who were close to moving into independent housing, about the fundraiser next month that would double their operating budget. As they prepared to leave, Rose caught sight of Alicia near the kitchen entrance. The Haven Project card clutched in her hand like a talisman. Their eyes met across the dining room, and Rose nodded once, a gesture of recognition, of solidarity, of silent promise. Outside, the city lights blazed against the night sky. Carlo's car waited at the curb, security detail discreet but present. Rose paused before entering, looking back at the bistro where her transformation had begun. What are you thinking? Carlo asked. That I'm grateful. Not for the violence, I'll never be grateful for that. But for surviving it. For the strength I discovered. For you appearing at exactly the right moment with exactly the right kind of help. Rose turned to face her husband. And for the life we've built together. Not you building it for me, but us building it as partners. Always partners, Carlo agreed. Though you should know, you're the stronger one in this marriage. Rose laughed, genuine and full. I'm the one who survived. You're the one who had the wisdom to recognize that survival was something worth protecting. They drove home together through the city that had almost destroyed Rose and had ultimately given her the space to rebuild herself. The Haven Project's first safe house passed by the window, lights glowing in second-floor windows where women slept without fear for the first time in years. Rose's phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother in Virginia, asking about the fundraiser and expressing pride in her granddaughter's work. Rose Barkley had arrived in this city 3 years ago, young and hopeful and unprepared for the violence that would nearly end her. Rose Gambino was leaving it tonight, not the city, but that version of herself, as a woman who'd learned that strength wasn't about never needing help, but about knowing when to accept it and how to transform survival into purpose. She reached for Carlo's hand in the darkness of the car, and he laced his fingers through hers with the easy intimacy of 2 people who'd chosen each other freely and would continue choosing each other every day. The girl with downcast eyes was gone, replaced by a woman who looked the world straight on and demanded it be better. And with Carlo beside her, not above her, not controlling her, but standing as her equal and her partner, Rose knew she had the power to make that demand stick. Rose Barkley walked into Marchand's bistro with downcast eyes and bruises hidden beneath carefully applied makeup. She walked out as Rose Gambino, not because a man saved her, but because she found the courage to accept help when she needed it most, and then did the hard work of rebuilding herself into someone she could respect. This story isn't just about surviving violence. It's about the transformation that happens when you stop merely enduring and start truly living. It's about the power of choosing yourself, even when that choice feels impossible. It's about understanding that needing help doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Rose's journey from that small apartment where she counted tips and planned her escape, to standing at a podium advocating for other survivors, reminds us that our darkest moments don't have to define us. They can refine us. They can become the foundation for purpose, for power, for a life we never imagined possible. And maybe that's the most important truth in Rose's story. You are not the worst thing that ever happened to you. You are what you choose to become after surviving it. If Rose's story resonated with you, if you saw yourself in her fear, her struggle, or her hope, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel is dedicated to stories of resilience, transformation, and the kind of love that empowers rather than controls. Every week, we explore narratives that challenge us to imagine better versions of ourselves and the world we live in. Second, share this video. You never know who in your life might be living Rose's story right now. Someone scrolling through their phone at 2 a.m., wondering if escape is possible. Someone who needs to hear that accepting help isn't weakness, that independence can be rebuilt, that there is life after survival. Your share could be the message that saves someone's life. Third, and this is the most important one, if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START to 88788 or visit thehotline.org for confidential support. Just like Rose had her Sentinel card, you have resources available. Real people, ready to help, with no judgment and no strings attached. And if you're not ready to call yet, if you're still in the planning stages like Rose was, that's okay too. Save this video. Come back to it when you need the reminder that escape is possible, that you deserve better, that there are people who will help you rebuild without demanding you surrender yourself in return. Comment below and let me know, what moment in Rose's journey hit you the hardest? Was it her courage to accept the Sentinel card? Her refusal to be with Carlo until she'd proven her independence? Or her return to Marchand's as a completely transformed woman? I read every comment, and your insights help shape the stories we tell on this channel. If you want to see more stories like this, romances that respect trauma, relationships built on equality, and female characters who claim their power rather than having it granted to them, let me know in the comments. Your engagement tells me what resonates, what matters, what stories need to be told. Remember, you deserve a life where you're not afraid. You deserve love that lifts you up rather than breaking you down. You deserve to walk into any room with your head held high, knowing that you chose yourself first, and everything else followed from that choice. Rose Barkley became Rose Gambino, but more importantly, she became herself, fully, powerfully, unapologetically herself. And that same transformation is available to you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about stories that matter. And thank you for being here, right now, taking this journey with me. Now go out there and choose yourself. The world is waiting for the person you'll become when you do. I'll see you in the next video.